In the spring of 1777, in the town of Brunswick in the Duchy of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a modest principality in what would eventually become northern Germany, a child was born into circumstances that gave almost no hint of what was to follow. His name was Johann Carl Friedrich Gauss, and his parents were working people of the most ordinary kind. His father, Gebhard Dietrich Gauss, was a gardener and a bricklayer and sometimes a canal worker, a man of physical strength and limited formal education who moved between whatever labor was available and who, by all accounts, had no particular gift for or interest in learning. His mother, Dorothea Benz, was the daughter of a stonemason, and she too had received almost no formal schooling, though she was, by the evidence of her later life, a woman of sharp intelligence and unusual warmth, who understood, long before anyone else did, what she had brought into the world. Brunswick was a town of some importance, a commercial center, a seat of Protestant culture, with a ducal court and a university and a cathedral whose bells marked the hours for a population that had lived in these same streets and squares for generations. It was not a place that expected to produce great mathematicians. It was a place that produced tradesmen and clergymen and minor officials, people who knew their station and filled it without complaint. The Gauss family lived in a small house in the working quarter of the town, and Gebhard Gauss worked with his hands and expected his son to do the same. Carl, as he was always called, was the only child of this marriage, and from his earliest years he was an anomaly in his own household. He could read before anyone had taught him. He taught himself by observing the letters on signs, and in the few books that the household contained, working out the relationships between the shapes and the sounds they represented, and arriving, without instruction, at literacy. His parents noticed this with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. They were not educated people. They had no framework for understanding what it meant that their small son could decipher words that adults had not shown him. The first story that is told about Gauss, told by Gauss himself in old age, with the precision of a man who had been turning a memory over for decades, concerns an error his father made. Gebhard Gauss was paying his workers one evening, and he was doing the calculation aloud. So many men, so many days, so many pfennigs per day, so many additions and multiplications to arrive at the final figure. The 3-year-old Carl, who had been sitting quietly nearby, said, "Father, the calculation is wrong. It should be this." And he gave the correct figure. Gebhard Gauss checked it. The child was right. This story has the quality of family legend, polished and simplified by repetition over generations, and it may not be precisely accurate in its details. But it is consistent with everything else that is known about Gauss's early life, and Gauss himself vouched for it, and there is no particular reason to doubt that something of this kind occurred. A child of 3 who corrects an adult's arithmetic is not a commonplace child. By the time Carl was 7 or 8 years old, the stories multiply and overlap in the way that stories about exceptional children always do, each one slightly more dramatic than the last, each one contributing to a portrait of a mind that operated at a different speed and in a different register than the minds around it. He memorized the Lutheran Catechism with such speed that his pastor was unnerved. He worked his way through arithmetic with a thoroughness that suggested not just ability, but appetite, not merely the capacity to compute, but a genuine desire to understand why the computations worked, what the rules were, and where they came from, and whether they were necessary or merely conventional. The story that has become most famous, the one that every mathematical biography of Gauss recounts, the one that has become, in popular culture, The defining image of his childhood genius took place in his school around the year 1786, when Carl was approximately 9 years old. The details vary slightly depending on who is telling it, but the essential shape is consistent across all the versions. The schoolmaster, a man named J.G. Butner, who taught an elementary class of perhaps 100 children in the crowded, underfunded school of a working-class district in Brunswick, set his class a task designed to keep them occupied for a long time. He told them to add up all the numbers from 1 to 100. It was the kind of problem that had an obvious approach. You started with 1, added 2, added 3, and kept going, carefully, until you reached 100. It would take most children the better part of an hour, and the task was understood by the teacher as a kind of disciplinary exercise, a way of imposing quiet, focused work on a class that needed occupying. Carl sat for a moment. Then he wrote a single number on his slate, turned it face down on the desk, and folded his hands. He did not begin adding from 1. He had seen something else. What he had seen, and what he had worked out in the few seconds before putting down his slate, was a pattern. The sum of 1 and 100 is 101. The sum of 2 and 99 is also 101. The sum of 3 and 98 is also 101. There are 50 such pairs. 50 times 101 is 5,050. The answer was 5,050, and Carl had found it not by laboriously adding one number to the next, but by seeing the structure of the problem, by recognizing that the numbers could be rearranged into a pattern that made the calculation trivial. When Butner collected the slates at the end of the hour, Carl's was the only one with the correct answer. The other children had worked dutifully through their additions and had arrived at wrong answers, or had not finished, or had made errors that compounded as the numbers grew. Carl had the right answer and had produced it in seconds, and he had produced it not by being faster at the standard method, but by finding a method that was categorically more powerful. A method that would work not just for 1 to 100, but for 1 to 1,000 or 1 to 1,000,000, for any arithmetic progression of any length. Butner was not a bad man, and he was not so blind as to miss what had happened. He was, by the accounts that survive, genuinely moved by what he had seen, and he sought out the best mathematics textbook available and gave it to Carl to work through. Carl worked through it in days. The next textbook was sent for. Carl worked through that too. Within a few years, Butner was honest enough to acknowledge that there was nothing left he could teach his most unusual pupil. He told anyone who would listen that the boy was something he had never encountered and could not explain. Word spread, as word always does in small towns, through the informal channels of gossip and professional connection, until it reached a man who mattered. Martin Bartels was a teacher's assistant at Butner's school, only a few years older than Gauss himself, and he was a young man of genuine mathematical ability who recognized in his pupil something entirely beyond his own gifts. Bartels began working with Gauss, outside school hours, going through advanced mathematics with him, and it was Bartels who first brought the child's abilities to the attention of the Duke of Brunswick's court. Carl Friedrich Gauss was 9 years old, the son of a bricklayer, living in 2 rooms in the working quarter of a provincial town, and he had just solved a problem in seconds that was meant to take an hour. He had not done it by being cleverer at the same thing everyone else was doing. He had done it by seeing differently, by looking at the numbers arranged on his mental slate and perceiving, in the arrangement, a symmetry that everyone else had missed. This ability to see in any mathematical structure the hidden pattern that made it legible that transformed it from a collection of individual elements into a coherent whole was not something he had been taught. It was simply how his mind worked. He would spend the rest of his life using it. The social world of the Gauss family in Brunswick was the world of working people who had no expectation of rising above their station. Gebhard Gauss was not unkind, but he was not a man who valued learning for its own sake. He had a practical view of life. You worked with your hands, you earned your bread, you provided for your family, and you did not waste time on things that did not contribute to these ends. The prospect of a son who sat and stared and moved his lips silently while computing something that had nothing to do with bricklaying or gardening was not, from Gebhard's perspective, necessarily a cause for celebration. He was proud of Carl, in his way, but the pride was complicated by incomprehension, by the sense that his son inhabited a world he could not follow, that the gift he had produced was somehow too large for the house it had been born into. Dorothea understood differently. She had no formal education, but she had intelligence of a practical and perceptive kind, and she knew, with the certainty of a woman who has watched her child from birth, that what she was seeing was not ordinary. She protected Carl. She argued with her husband when Gebhard's plans for the boy's future seemed to foreclose possibilities that she could not name but sensed were there. She did not know what a mathematician was, or a professor, or a royal astronomer. She knew that her son was different, and that different meant something, and she trusted that meaning even when she could not articulate it. She lived long enough to see that trust vindicated. She survived until 1839, well into Carl's fame and professional success, and she moved in her old age into the observatory house at Göttingen, where she lived with her son for the last 4 years of her life. She had been blind for many years by then, and Carl cared for her with a tenderness that those who knew him in his professional persona found surprising. He was reserved with colleagues, controlled in his public manner, not given to obvious displays of warmth. With his mother, he was different. She had believed in him before belief was rational, and he knew it, and he loved her for it, with a simplicity and a depth that were not complicated by any of the ambivalences that marked his other close relationships. Butner, the schoolmaster who had set the 100 numbers problem, deserves more credit than he usually receives. He was a man of the 18th century, trained in the methods of rote learning and corporal discipline that characterized elementary education in his time and place, and he was working with classes of 100 children in conditions of chronic underfunding and overcrowding. That he recognized what Gauss had done, that he sought out better textbooks for him, that he treated the child's abilities as a gift rather than a disruption, required a generosity of spirit that not everyone in his position would have had. He was not a great teacher, and he knew it. He was honest enough and large-hearted enough to acknowledge that he had encountered something greater than himself, and to respond by helping it forward rather than resenting it. Martin Bartels, who went on to become a professor of mathematics himself, first in Russia, then in Germany, never forgot his strange tutorial relationship with the boy who had been his student and had, almost immediately, become his intellectual equal. He wrote about Gauss in later years with a warmth and a pride that were genuine. He had helped to bring a remarkable thing into the world, and he knew it. The Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel in the 1780s was a man named Carl Wilhelm Ferdinand, and he was, by the standards of his era and his position, an unusually enlightened ruler. He was not a great general or a great politician. He was a man who read widely, who valued learning, who took a genuine interest in the intellectual life of his duchy, and who had established a tradition of patronage that had already brought several distinguished scholars to Brunswick and its environs. He believed, and this belief was more practical than it might appear, that discovering and cultivating exceptional talent was a legitimate function of aristocratic power, that the discovery of a prodigy among his subjects and the provision of the means for that prodigy to develop was not charity but stewardship. He was the kind of patron that the 18th century occasionally produced, not always wise, not always consistent, but genuinely committed to the idea that genius deserved support regardless of the social station in which it happened to appear. Martin Bartels had written to the ducal court, or spoken to someone who had access to the court, about the remarkable child at Butner's school. The story reached Carl Wilhelm Ferdinand. He arranged to meet the boy. The meeting took place. The exact circumstances are not fully documented, and the Duke was apparently as impressed as everyone else who had encountered the young Gauss. Here was a child from a working-class family who spoke with precision and thought with clarity, and who seemed to inhabit a mental world of unusual richness, a world built of numbers and patterns and relationships that he could access with a fluency that the Duke found both impressive and somewhat strange. The Duke decided to support him. He did not do this casually or half-heartedly. He did it with the thoroughness of a man who understood that talent of this kind was rare, and that failing to nurture it was a kind of waste he was not willing to countenance. He arranged for Carl to attend the Collegium Carolinum in Brunswick, a secondary institution of some distinction that provided a serious education in the classical languages, in literature, in philosophy, and in the sciences. He provided a small stipend, enough to relieve the Gauss family of the need to put Carl to work as soon as he was old enough, and he continued this support for the rest of his own life, until his death in 1806. Gauss arrived at the Collegium Carolinum in 1792 at the age of 15. He was, by his own later account, well prepared for the academic work, but unprepared for the social world of an institution that was considerably more elevated than anything he had previously encountered. His classmates were the sons of merchants and minor officials and professional men, people who had grown up with books in their houses and tutors in their nurseries, and the assumption that education was a natural part of life. Gauss had grown up with none of this. He was acutely conscious of his origins in the way that clever people who have come from nothing are always conscious of them. Not ashamed, exactly, but aware, perpetually and precisely aware, of the distance between where he had started and where he now found himself. He handled the social dimension of the collegium with the strategy that he would use, in various forms, for the rest of his life. He kept to himself. He was polite, he was quiet, he was thorough in his work, and he did not seek out friendships or social alliances that might require him to pretend to an ease he did not feel. He had never found human company particularly stimulating, or rather, he had found that most human company did not interest him in the way that mathematics interested him, that conversations about ordinary things felt thin and unsatisfying compared to the richness of the problems he preferred to think about. He was not cold or unkind. He was simply elsewhere in the way that people who think in mathematics are elsewhere. What he found at the collegium that did excite him was the library. He read voraciously, not just mathematics, though mathematics was always the primary subject, but Latin and Greek and classical literature, and the work of Newton and Euler and Lagrange and the other great mathematicians of the 17th and 18th centuries. He read Newton's Principia in the original Latin and understood it. He read Euler's vast mathematical output. Euler was the most prolific mathematician in history, and his collected works run to more than 70 volumes, and found in Euler's work both a model and a challenge. Here was a mind that had seen more of mathematics than almost anyone else, and yet there were things that Euler had missed, things that Gauss could already see that Euler had not seen. He also, during these years, began keeping what would become one of the most important and most enigmatic documents in the history of mathematics, his mathematical diary. The diary was a small notebook, and in it Gauss recorded his discoveries, not in the form of proofs or developed arguments, but as brief, sometimes cryptic entries, dates and statements, notation that only he fully understood. The first entry was made on the 30th of March, 1796. Over the following 18 years until 1814, he made 146 entries. Each entry was a discovery of some kind, a theorem or a result or a method that Gauss had found and wished to mark as found, without yet being ready or willing to share it. The diary was not discovered until 1898, 15 years after Gauss's death, when his collected papers were being organized. When mathematicians examined it, they found entry after entry that represented a significant advance in mathematics, results that had been published by other mathematicians, sometimes decades after Gauss's diary entry, who had received full credit for the discovery because Gauss had never published. The diary was a record of extraordinary fertility, a mind that was producing major mathematical results faster than it could or would share them. This raises a question that runs through the whole of Gauss's intellectual life, and that has no entirely satisfying answer. Why did he not publish? He had the results. He had, in many cases, the proofs. He had a patronage arrangement that gave him the financial freedom to pursue his work without the commercial pressures that might have hurried a less fortunate man. And yet he held back, again and again, sitting on results for years and sometimes decades, publishing only when the proof was polished to his extraordinary standard of completeness and rigor, or sometimes not publishing at all. The answer that Gauss himself gave, on the rare occasions when he was pressed on the point, was a phrase in Latin that he used as a personal motto, pauca sed matura, few, but ripe. He would publish few things, but what he published would be finished, completely finished, every step accounted for, every possible objection answered, every loose end tied. The rough drafts and the intermediate steps and the false paths and the heuristic arguments that had led him to the result were not for the world. The world would see only the completed building, not the scaffolding. This was, in one sense, a commitment to intellectual rigor of the most severe kind. In another sense, it meant that Gauss's published work presented to the world a series of apparently miraculous results whose origins were invisible, because the process of discovery had been carefully hidden. Later mathematicians, trying to understand how he had arrived at his results, sometimes said that he was like a fox who swept away his tracks with his tail as he walked. At the Collegium Carolinum, he swept his tracks with great diligence. He absorbed the existing mathematics, pushed it further, recorded what he found in his diary, and waited. He was waiting, though he may not have known it, for a discovery that would change the direction of his life. The years at the Collegium also taught him something about his own nature that would remain true for the rest of his life. He was not a person who required the company of others in order to be complete. He was, in a precise and non-pathological sense, self-sufficient. The life of the mind provided him with a richness that social interaction, which required compromises and adjustments, and the management of other people's expectations, did not. He was not hostile to other people. He was simply not dependent on them in the way that more socially oriented personalities are. He could sit alone for hours with a problem and feel not loneliness but something closer to the opposite. The particular satisfaction of a mind fully engaged, with no distraction and no interruption, working at the pace and in the direction that the problem required. The Duke's support continued throughout the collegium years and beyond. Carl Wilhelm Ferdinand proved to be a patron of unusual constancy, not merely providing the initial scholarship and then moving on, as some patrons did, but maintaining a genuine interest in his protégé's progress, making himself available for reports on what Gauss was working on, occasionally discussing mathematics with him at a level that was certainly beyond the Duke's technical ability, but that reflected a genuine desire to understand what his investment had produced. Gauss was grateful for this, and he expressed his gratitude in the dedication of the Disquisitiones Arithmeticae, where he acknowledged the Duke's support in terms that were warm and precise, neither servile nor perfunctory. The Duke also ensured that Gauss's transition from the Collegium to the University of Göttingen was smoothly arranged. The Duke had connections at Göttingen. Hanover and Brunswick were neighboring principalities with overlapping aristocratic and academic networks, and the recommendation that Carl Friedrich Gauss be admitted and supported there was one that the university was not inclined to refuse. Gauss arrived in Göttingen in 1795 with a stipend that covered his basic expenses, a letter of recommendation from the most powerful man in his duchy, and mathematical notebooks already full of results that the professors he was nominally there to learn from would not have been able to produce. On the 30th of March, 1796, Carl Friedrich Gauss woke up, and this is not a metaphor, though it is almost too neat a detail to seem real, with the solution to a problem that had been waiting unsolved for 2,000 years. He was 18 years old. He was a student at the University of Göttingen, where the Duke of Brunswick's patronage had brought him the previous year. He had been at Göttingen for only a few months, and he had not yet decided whether to devote his life to mathematics or to philology, to the study of ancient languages and texts, in which he was also extraordinarily gifted. He had not yet made the decision that would define the rest of his life. And then, on the last day of March, the decision was made for him. The problem concerned the construction of regular polygons, using only a compass and a straightedge, the classical tools of Greek geometry, the instruments of Euclid. The ancient Greeks had known how to construct certain regular polygons: the equilateral triangle with 3 sides, the square with 4, the regular pentagon with 5, the regular hexagon with 6, and the polygons that could be derived from these by repeated bisection of their angles. They had not known how to construct many others: the regular heptagon with 7 sides, for instance, or the regular polygon with 11 sides. For 2,000 years no one had extended the classical list. No one had proven which polygons could be constructed and which could not. The problem had sat, essentially untouched, since the time of Euclid. Gauss had found the answer. Specifically, he had proven that a regular polygon with 17 sides, a heptadecagon, could be constructed with compass and straightedge alone. More than this, he had found the general condition. A regular polygon with a prime number of sides could be constructed with compass and straightedge, if and only if that prime number had a specific mathematical form. It had to be a Fermat prime, a prime number of the form 2 raised to a power of 2 plus 1. The known Fermat primes were 3, 5, 17, 257, and 65,537. These, and only these prime-sided polygons, and the polygons derived from them, could be constructed with the classical tools. This was a result of extraordinary depth and beauty. It was not just a fact about polygons. It was a statement about the relationship between geometry and number theory, a demonstration that questions about which geometric constructions were possible were secretly questions about the structure of prime numbers, about a classification of integers that had been introduced by Pierre de Fermat in the 17th century and that had seemed, until Gauss, to have nothing to do with geometry at all. He had found a bridge between two branches of mathematics that had seemed entirely separate, and in finding it had solved a problem that the greatest mathematicians of the preceding 2 millennia had not solved. He made the first entry in his mathematical diary, the date, the 30th of March 1796, and a brief notation. Then he wrote to his teachers and to the Duke. Then he decided to be a mathematician. He entered Göttingen in 1795, with the university still processing what to make of him. Göttingen was, by the standards of German universities at the end of the 18th century, a relatively new institution, founded in 1734 by the Elector of Hanover. But it had already established a reputation for mathematical excellence that drew serious students from across the German-speaking world. The mathematician Abraham Kastner was the senior figure in mathematics there, and he was a competent teacher and a reasonable scholar, but he was not a man of the first rank, and Gauss seems to have recognized this quickly. He found at Göttingen a library of extraordinary quality, and he found a community of serious students who shared his interests, and he found, more crucially than anything else, the freedom and the resources to think. He also found in Göttingen the first significant friendship of his intellectual life. The friend's name was Wolfgang Bolyai, a young Hungarian mathematician who had come to Göttingen to study and who would eventually become, in his own right, a mathematician of some distinction. Though his greatest mathematical legacy would come not from his own work, but from his son, János Bolyai, who would independently discover non-Euclidean geometry decades later. Wolfgang Bolyai and Gauss walked and talked and argued about mathematics in the way that young men who share an extraordinary passion sometimes do, with an intensity and an intimacy that neither of them would quite recapture in later life. They remained in correspondence for the rest of their lives, and the letters between them, warm, technical, occasionally melancholy, always honest, are among the most humanizing documents in Gauss's biography. The heptadecagon discovery, and the decision it precipitated, changed everything about Gauss's sense of his own trajectory. He had been, before March 1796, a prodigy with multiple possible futures. He might have been a classical scholar, he might have found some other path, he might have drifted into a career that used his abilities without fully stretching them. After March 1796, there was no ambiguity. He was a mathematician. He was already at 18 a mathematician of the first rank, and he knew it. Not with vanity, which Gauss was not particularly prone to, but with the simple recognition of a man who has found the thing he was made for and is no longer uncertain about what to do next. He spent the remaining years of his time at Göttingen in a state of extraordinary productivity. The mathematical diary filled up. Entry after entry, discovery after discovery, each one recorded in its brief notation and then set aside. He was working on number theory above all, on the deep structure of the integers, on the patterns in prime numbers, on the behavior of quadratic forms and quadratic residues, on problems that had been noticed by earlier mathematicians, but not solved, not explained, not placed in a framework that made their patterns intelligible. He was building, though he did not yet know the final form of the edifice, the structure that would become his masterwork. He submitted his doctoral dissertation to the University of Helmstedt in 1799, not Göttingen, where his supervisor had died, but Helmstedt, where the mathematician Johann Friedrich Pfaff was willing to take him on. The dissertation contained the first rigorous proof of the fundamental theorem of algebra, the statement that every polynomial equation with complex coefficients has at least one complex root. The result had been assumed and partially proved by various predecessors, but no one had managed a proof that was watertight by the standards of rigorous mathematics. Gauss gave 4 different proofs over the course of his career, each one improving on the last. As if the theorem were a gem he kept finding new ways to cut. He was 21 years old, and he had already accomplished more than most mathematicians accomplish in a lifetime. He was just beginning. The heptadecagon proof, and the doctoral dissertation, and the number theory that was accumulating in his notebooks. All of these existed in a particular historical context that is worth pausing to understand. The late 18th century was a period of extraordinary mathematical productivity, and Gauss was entering a field that was not empty but crowded with brilliant people. Lagrange in Paris, Legendre in Paris, Laplace in Paris, 3 of the greatest mathematicians of the age, all working in the same city, with all the resources of post-revolutionary French scientific culture behind them. In Germany, the mathematical tradition was less concentrated, less institutionally supported, but it was real. Euler's legacy was everywhere, and the German universities were beginning to develop the research culture that would make them the dominant force in 19th century mathematics and science. Gauss entered this world as an outsider in more than one sense. He was from a working-class family. He had no academic connections, he had no patron in the mathematical community, and he came from a provincial town that the great centers of European mathematics, Paris above all, regarded with the polite indifference that cultural capitals reserve for the provinces. He had the Duke's support, which was financial and social but not mathematical. He had his own ability, which was beyond anything his contemporaries could assess until he showed it to them. He showed it to them in ways that were, characteristically, as deliberate as they were decisive. The announcement of the heptadecagon construction, made through a brief notice in a scientific journal in 1796, was the opening move. It announced that a problem 2,000 years old had been solved, gave the statement of the result, and a hint of the method, and invited the mathematical world to investigate further. The Disquisitiones Arithmeticae, which was in preparation throughout the later 1790s, was the coup de grace. By the time the Disquisitiones appeared in 1801, the mathematical world had received enough evidence to form its assessment. The University of Helmstedt, where Gauss defended his doctoral dissertation, was a small and not particularly distinguished institution. It would close in 1809, but it served the purpose, and Johann Friedrich Pfaff, who supervised the dissertation, was a genuine mathematician who appreciated what Gauss had done. The relationship between Pfaff and Gauss was warm and mutually respectful, and Pfaff later helped arrange for the Disquisitiones to be published. The doctoral dissertation itself, the proof of the fundamental theorem of algebra, was a work of considerable subtlety. The theorem says that every polynomial with complex coefficients has at least one complex root. A simple statement that had been assumed for over a century, and that Gauss, to his dissatisfaction, found had never been rigorously proved. The existing arguments had gaps, places where an implicit assumption had been made without justification, where a geometric intuition had been relied upon without being converted into rigorous analysis. Gauss identified these gaps with the precision of a surgeon identifying diseased tissue, and then he healed them, providing a proof that was, for the first time, genuinely complete. He was 21 years old when he did this. He would give 4 different proofs of the same theorem over the course of his career, each one technically stronger than the last, as if he could not stop finding new ways into the result, new angles from which its truth could be seen and verified. The world into which the Disquisitiones appeared in 1801 was a world that had been transformed by revolution. The French Revolution had remade European politics. The Industrial Revolution was remaking European economies, but that had not yet absorbed the full implications of those transformations. Mathematics in 1801 was still largely conducted on aristocratic patronage through learned societies and royal academies in the mode of the 18th century. Gauss was among the last products of the old system, born to nothing, raised by ducal patronage, educated in institutions supported by nobility, and also among the first figures of a new one, in which the university would replace the court as the primary institution of scientific life. He spent his career in that transition, benefiting from the old patronage and contributing to the new institutional structures, and the Disquisitiones stands at that boundary, a product of the old world's resources and the new world's intellectual ambitions. In 1801, when Gauss was 23 years old, he published the work that would define his reputation for the rest of the century and beyond. It was called the Disquisitiones Arithmeticae, the arithmetical investigations, and it was, by wide agreement among mathematicians who have read it, the most important single work in the history of number theory. A book that did for the study of integers what Newton's Principia had done for the study of motion. It gathered the scattered results and techniques of 100 years of work, organized them into a coherent framework, extended them far beyond what anyone had previously achieved, and left the field permanently transformed. The book had taken years to write, and years more to see through the press. The original manuscript had been submitted to a publisher in 1798, when Gauss was only 20. But the printing was delayed by financial difficulties at the press and did not appear until 1801. The wait was agonizing in one sense. Gauss had been sitting on a finished masterpiece for 3 years while the printers delayed, and in another sense it gave him time to revise, to add material, to cut sections he was not satisfied with. The 7th and final section of the published book, dealing with the theory of equations defining the roots of unity and its connection to the geometry of regular polygons, was added during this waiting period, and it is one of the most beautiful sections of the book, a demonstration that the heptadecagon construction of 1796, which had launched his mathematical career, was not an isolated result, but the surface expression of a deep theory connecting number theory, algebra, and geometry in a way that no one before Gauss had clearly seen. The book had been written largely before Gauss arrived at the directorship of the observatory, drafted during his time at Göttingen, in his rooms, in the intervals between the other mathematical work that was always in progress. It was, in one sense, the crystallization of everything he had been thinking about for the previous several years. The number theory, the quadratic residues, the cyclotomic polynomials that underlay the heptadecagon construction, the theory of quadratic forms. In another sense, it was something new, a systematic re-examination of all of this material from a single, unifying perspective, organized with the rigor and the completeness that Gauss demanded of everything he published. The central organization of the Disquisition was the concept of congruence, the relationship between two integers that have the same remainder when divided by a given number. Gauss introduced the notation that is still used today. A is congruent to B modulo n, written with 3 horizontal lines rather than 2. This was not just a notational convenience, but a conceptual move of the first importance. By treating congruence as an equivalence relation, as a way of partitioning the integers into classes based on their remainder structure, Gauss gave number theory a new language that made previously intractable problems tractable and revealed patterns that had been invisible in the older notation. He used this language to prove and organize the law of quadratic reciprocity, a theorem that describes the relationship between the solubility of two quadratic congruences modulo two different primes. The theorem had been noticed and partially proved by Legendre and others, but Gauss gave the first completely rigorous proof, and he gave it a depth of context that his predecessors' work had lacked. He would eventually find 8 distinct proofs of the theorem over the course of his life. Proof after proof, each illuminating a different aspect of the result, as if he could not stop seeing new ways into it. He called it the Theorema Aureum, the Golden Theorem, with an affection that was entirely characteristic of the way he related to mathematics, not as an abstract exercise, but as something genuinely beautiful, deserving of admiration. The disquisitions also contained a treatment of the theory of quadratic forms, expressions of the form ax squared plus bxy plus cy squared, where a, b, c are integers, that Gauss elevated from a collection of special results into a systematic theory. He classified quadratic forms by their discriminant, he showed how they could be composed, he proved deep theorems about which integers were represented by which forms. This was work of the most profound originality, and its implications for algebraic number theory. The field that would dominate much of the 19th century, and that remains active today, were so vast that mathematicians are still following the paths Gauss opened. The book was not easy. It was written in Latin in the dense, polished style that Gauss favored, every proof complete, every definition precise, no shortcuts, no appeals to intuition that had not been supported by argument. Mathematicians who read it found it overwhelming. Here was a book that seemed to contain an entire world of mathematical truth, presented with a completeness and a rigor that were unlike anything previously seen. Adrien-Marie Legendre, the French mathematician who had been working on number theory for decades and who found several of his own results presented in the Disquisitiones with better proofs than he had been able to give them, reportedly expressed a mixture of admiration and frustration that contemporaries found entirely understandable. He had been working in the same field for years, and this 23-year-old from a working-class family in Brunswick had simply surpassed him. Niels Henrik Abel, the young Norwegian mathematician who would himself die at 26 after a brief life of extraordinary achievement, said that Gauss had written a masterpiece that could be read but never finished, that every time you returned to it, you found something new, something you had missed before, some consequence or connection that the density of the material had concealed on previous readings. This experience of inexhaustibility is still reported by mathematicians who work through the Disquisitiones today. The publication of the Disquisitiones established Gauss's reputation throughout the mathematical world of Europe, or rather, it would have done so more rapidly if the book had been more widely read. The difficulty of the material and the inaccessibility of the Latin limited its immediate audience, and the depth of its contents meant that full appreciation took years, and in some cases, decades. But among those who did read it and could follow it, Legendre, Sophie Germain, Fourier, eventually Dirichlet, who would become the preeminent number theorist of the generation after Gauss. The book was understood as an event in the history of mathematics, something that had happened, that had changed the landscape permanently, that could not be undone. Gauss himself, having published it, turned to other things. This was characteristic of him. Not the man who spends a career mining the implications of a single great achievement, but the man who moves on, who finds the next problem, who is constitutionally incapable of staying in one place for long regardless of the richness of the territory. The Disquisitiones was done. It was published. It was, in his own assessment, not yet finished. There were things he had not managed to include, things that needed more work, but it was done enough to send into the world. He turned, in 1801, to the sky. What he left behind in the Disquisitiones was not just a collection of results, but a way of doing mathematics, a standard of rigor, a quality of conceptual organization, an expectation of completeness that shaped the practice of mathematics for the rest of the century. The next generation of German mathematicians, and particularly the students who would study at Göttingen in the decades when Gauss was its dominant intellectual presence, absorbed this standard from the air around them, from the example of what had been done, and from the implicit demand that what they did should be comparable. Peter Gustav Lejeune Dirichlet, who became the leading number theorist of the generation after Gauss, described himself as having read the Disquisitiones so many times that he could recite passages from memory. He carried a copy with him on his travels. For Dirichlet, the Disquisitiones was not a book to be consulted, but a world to be inhabited. The theory of quadratic forms that the Disquisitiones contained would flower in the hands of Dirichlet, and then Ernst Kummer, and then Richard Dedekind, into the theory of algebraic number fields, the deep structural understanding of numbers defined by polynomial equations, which is one of the central preoccupations of number theory to this day. The ideas that Gauss introduced in 1801 in the language of quadratic forms and congruences were reformulated and generalized and deepened by the successors he had inspired, and each reformulation revealed new connections and new depths that Gauss had not seen or had seen and not published. The Disquisitiones was not just a book, it was a program, an invitation to a way of thinking that a whole tradition of mathematics would take up and pursue for the following 2 centuries. The law of quadratic reciprocity that the Disquisitiones contained, the Theorema Aureum, the Golden Theorem, acquired, in the hands of subsequent mathematicians, generalizations of extraordinary scope. Gauss himself worked on generalizations, finding extensions of the reciprocity law for higher powers, recording them in his diary but not publishing them to his own satisfaction. Eisenstein, Jacobi, Kummer, and eventually Emil Artin would extend the law in ways that led to some of the deepest results in algebraic number theory. The general reciprocity law, in the form proved by Artin in 1927, is a consequence of the broader framework of class field theory, one of the major achievements of 20th century mathematics. Every link in that long chain leads back to the Golden Theorem in the Disquisitiones, to the young man from Brunswick who saw the pattern in the numbers and spent years polishing the proof until it shone. On the first day of January 1801, the Italian astronomer Giuseppe Piazzi, working at his observatory in Palermo, noticed a faint object moving slowly against the background of fixed stars. He tracked it for 41 nights, accumulating a set of positional observations, and then published his findings. The object, which Piazzi named Ceres, after the Roman goddess of the harvest and the patron deity of Sicily, was believed to be a new planet, orbiting the Sun in the gap between Mars and Jupiter, where astronomers had long suspected a planet might exist, based on a numerical pattern in the planetary distances called the Titius-Bode law. The discovery was announced to the scientific world with appropriate excitement, and for a brief moment it seemed that the solar system had delivered a gift perfectly timed with the new century. And then it was lost. Ceres moved through the sky on its orbit, passed behind the sun from the perspective of the Earth, and when it emerged on the other side, no one could find it. The original observations covered only a tiny arc of its orbit. Piazzi had tracked it for 41 nights before illness interrupted his work, and in that time Ceres had moved through only a few degrees of its full orbital path, and that arc was insufficient for the standard methods of orbital calculation to predict, with any reliability, where Ceres would reappear. The leading astronomers of the day attempted the calculation and admitted defeat. The best methods available, developed over the preceding century for use with the much larger observational datasets available for the known planets, simply could not extract a reliable orbit from so small an arc. The object had been found and immediately lost, and the astronomical community was confronted with a problem that seemed, given the tools available, very close to insoluble. Gauss read about the problem. He was 23 years old, and he had just sent the disquisitiones to the printer, and he was looking for something new to think about. Celestial mechanics, the mathematical description of how bodies moved under gravity, was not his primary field, but it was a domain in which the mathematical tools he had developed were potentially applicable, and the specific problem of finding Ceres from insufficient data was exactly the kind of challenge that his particular combination of theoretical insight and computational power was suited for. He developed a new method for determining the orbit of a celestial body from a small number of observations, a method that was significantly more powerful than the existing approaches, which required larger arcs and more observations to produce reliable results. The centerpiece of the method was what Gauss called the method of least squares, a systematic procedure for finding the orbit that best fitted the available data, in the sense of minimizing the sum of the squares of the differences between the predicted and observed positions. This was not merely a computational trick. It was a solution to the general problem of how to extract the best possible estimate of an unknown quantity from a set of imperfect measurements, a problem that arises in every branch of quantitative science. He calculated where Ceres should be. His prediction placed it in a specific region of the sky at a specific time. When astronomers pointed their telescopes at that region of the sky, at that time, Ceres was there, precisely where Gauss had said it would be. The object that had been lost was found. Gauss became, overnight, famous across Europe in a way that the Disquisitiones, a highly technical mathematical treatise, read by few people outside the professional mathematical community, had not made him. Astronomers who outnumbered pure mathematicians several times over, and who had a wider network of public interest and royal support, celebrated him. He became the young genius who had found the lost planet. The method of least squares was published in 1809 in a work called Theoria Modus Corporum Coelestium, the theory of the motion of celestial bodies, which laid out both the mathematical theory underlying the orbital calculations and the statistical methods Gauss had developed to handle uncertain data. The method of least squares has since become one of the most widely used mathematical techniques in all of quantitative science, in physics, in economics, in biology, in engineering, in any field that involves fitting a model to data. Every time a researcher fits a line through scattered data points, every time a statistician estimates a parameter from noisy measurements, every time a machine learning algorithm adjusts its weights in response to a training set, it is doing something that Gauss formalized in the cold months of late 1801 while computing the orbit of a small body between Mars and Jupiter. He had also, it emerged some years later, discovered the method of least squares before anyone else, before Legendre, who published it first in 1805. The claim to priority became one of the bitterest disputes of Gauss's later career, not least because it followed the pattern of the diary. Gauss claiming to have found something years before the publication date, Legendre disputing the claim, the mathematical community forced to adjudicate between the word of a man who had published and the word of a man who had not. Gauss produced evidence that he had used the method since at least 1795, 10 years before Legendre's publication. Whether this constituted true priority was argued then and has been argued since. The seer's prediction opened a new phase of Gauss's career. He was appointed director of the Göttingen Observatory in 1807, a position he held for the rest of his life. It came with a salary, a comfortable house on the observatory grounds, and a set of responsibilities that were at least partly administrative and observational, rather than purely theoretical. Gauss was not entirely pleased by the administrative dimension. He found the routine of observing and recording and corresponding with other observatories tedious, in a way that pure mathematics was never tedious. But the appointment gave him security and status, and the resources to pursue whatever work interested him, and he was grateful for it. His domestic life in these years was organized around 2 marriages. His first wife, Johanna Osthoff, whom he had married in 1805, was a woman he loved with a warmth and an openness that were not characteristic of his relationships with most people. The letters he wrote to her are among the most personally revealing documents in his biography. Tender, playful, honest, in a way that his scientific correspondence rarely was. She died in 1809, shortly after the birth of their 3rd child, and the loss devastated him in a way that he never entirely recovered from. He wrote to his friend Wolfgang Bolyai that the world had lost its beauty. He remarried in 1810 to Friederike Waldeck, the friend of his first wife, partly for the practical reason that his children needed a mother, and partly, one suspects, because loneliness was not something his constitution could easily sustain. The second marriage was comfortable and respectful, but not warm in the way the first had been. Gauss continued his work. The Göttingen Observatory, which became Gauss's home and workplace for nearly half a century, was a serious scientific institution with a tradition of careful observational work. Gauss upgraded its instruments, improved its procedures, and applied to the observation of the sky the same standards of precision that he applied to everything else. He was not primarily an observational astronomer. He was a mathematician who used astronomy as a domain for his mathematical methods, but he took the observational work seriously, and the data that emerged from Göttingen under his directorship was of unusually high quality. The fame that the series prediction brought him opened doors that the Disquisitiones had not. Astronomical fame in the early 19th century was public fame in a way that purely mathematical fame was not. The recovery of a lost celestial body was a story that newspapers could tell, and that educated non-specialists could appreciate, whereas the theory of quadratic residues was accessible only to a small professional community. Gauss received correspondence from all over Europe after the series calculation, from astronomers and from general admirers, and he answered it with the methodical thoroughness that characterized all his correspondence. Carefully, precisely, not always warmly, but never dismissively. He was famous now, in the way that a man of science could be famous in 1801, and he wore the fame with the same slightly distant self-possession that he brought to everything else. The method of least squares continued to propagate through the sciences in ways that Gauss could not have fully anticipated. It was taken up by astronomers, by geodesists, by physicists, by economists, by anyone who had data and needed to extract from it the best possible estimate of an unknown quantity. The mathematics of uncertainty and estimation that Gauss developed in the context of orbital mechanics became, by the end of the 19th century, a universal tool of quantitative science, as indispensable as calculus and as widely used. When Gauss wrote about it in the Theoria Motus, he could not have imagined the contexts in which it would eventually be applied: the medical trials, the economic models, the weather forecasts, the machine learning algorithms of 2 centuries later. He had found, in trying to locate a small rock between Mars and Jupiter, a method for finding anything at all from imperfect information. It was, in its way, a perfect encapsulation of his genius. In the summer of 1818, Gauss accepted an assignment that took him away from his observatory and his desk and his telescope, and placed him, for the better part of a decade, in the fields and forests and hills of the Kingdom of Hanover. He was to conduct a geodetic survey, a precise geometrical mapping of the territory, and the project would occupy him in one form or another until 1825. He was 40 years old when it began, and he was not physically well suited to field work. He was sedentary by inclination, accustomed to the indoor life of scholarship, not fond of travel or physical discomfort, not robust in the way that outdoor work over many seasons required. He complained in letters about the heat and the insects and the tedium of waiting for clear weather and the unreliability of local guides and the impossibility of finding adequate food at rural inns. He continued working despite all of this, because the alternative was to leave the work undone, and leaving work undone was not something Gauss did. The geodetic survey was commissioned by the government of Hanover, which wanted an accurate map of its territory, and by the Danish government, which wanted to connect its survey to the Hanoverian one, and eventually to the broader European triangulation network that several countries were then engaged in building. The practical motivation was administrative and military. Accurate maps were essential for taxation, for road and canal planning, for military operations, for all the functions of a modern administrative state. Gauss's mathematical gifts were engaged for what was, on the surface, a practical rather than a theoretical enterprise. The project required measuring the angles between visible points across large distances, a triangulation network that would allow the positions of points on the Earth's surface to be established with great precision. The instrument used for this purpose was called a heliotrope, a mirror that reflected sunlight to a distant observer, creating a point of light that could be aimed and used as a sighting target across distances of many miles. Gauss invented an improved heliotrope himself, because the existing instruments were not precise enough for his purposes. This was characteristic. When the available tools were insufficient, he built better ones. He spent summers in the field, directing teams of surveyors, climbing church towers and hills to establish sight lines, doing the calculations that converted observations into coordinates, writing reports to the Hanoverian government that commissioned the work. He wrote letters to his family from these field postings that have a quality of quiet complaint. He missed his books. He missed the quiet of the observatory. He found the logistics of field operations tedious. He was tired. He continued working. The theoretical work that the survey inspired was not about the survey itself, but about the deeper mathematical questions it raised. If you are mapping the surface of the Earth with great precision, you cannot treat that surface as flat. The Earth is a curved body, and mapping curved surfaces requires a mathematics that the classical flat geometry of Euclid does not provide. Gauss had been thinking about curved surfaces for years, in the way that he thought about everything. Quietly, persistently, building up a framework before anyone else knew he was working on the problem. In 1827, he published a paper called Disquisitiones Generales circa superficies curvas, General Investigations of Curved Surfaces, which laid the foundations of what would eventually become the field of differential geometry. The paper introduced concepts that would prove to be among the most important in the whole of mathematics: the idea of the intrinsic geometry of a curved surface, the geometry that can be measured and described entirely in terms of distances and angles on the surface itself, without any reference to the surrounding three-dimensional space in which the surface is embedded. The central result of the paper was what Gauss called the theorema egregium, the remarkable theorem, and it says, in essence, that the curvature of a surface is an intrinsic property. It can be detected and measured entirely from within the surface, without any knowledge of how the surface sits in the surrounding space. This is not obvious. A flat sheet of paper has zero curvature. If you roll that sheet into a cylinder, the surface looks curved from outside, but from the perspective of an ant walking on it, it is still flat. You can still do ordinary Euclidean geometry on it without any distortion. The curvature of a sphere, by contrast, is genuinely intrinsic. The geometry on a sphere is detectably different from Euclidean geometry, and this difference is not an artifact of how the sphere is embedded in space, but a real property of the surface itself. The theorema egregium was not just a beautiful theorem about surfaces. It was the beginning of a way of thinking about geometry that would, in the hands of Gauss's student Bernhard Riemann, become the mathematics of curved spaces of any dimension. The mathematics that Einstein would use 90 years later to describe gravity as the curvature of four-dimensional spacetime. When Einstein needed a geometry for general relativity, the geometry he needed was Riemannian geometry, which was Riemannian geometry because Riemann had extended the ideas that Gauss had introduced in the 1827 paper. The line from the Hanoverian land survey to the general theory of relativity runs with surprising directness through the theorema egregium. Gauss had also, during the survey years, thought seriously about a question that had been troubling geometers since antiquity: the parallel postulate. Euclid had assumed, as one of his 5 axioms, that through a point not on a given line, exactly one line could be drawn parallel to the given line. Mathematicians had suspected for centuries that this axiom was not truly independent of the others, that it could be derived from them, and had tried many times to prove it. They had all failed. Gauss had a different suspicion. Not that the parallel postulate followed from the others, but that it was genuinely independent, and that a consistent geometry could be built in which it did not hold, in which parallel lines either did not exist or existed in multiple copies through any external point. He had worked out, privately, the beginning of such a geometry. He called it, privately, non-Euclidean geometry. He did not publish it. He did not publish it because he was afraid. And this is one of the few occasions in Gauss's life where the word afraid is genuinely appropriate of the reaction. He wrote to Bolyai that the outcry from the beorders, the uncomprehending public, would be too great to bear. He watched in silence when Bolyai's son Janos published his own non-Euclidean geometry in 1832, and when Nikolai Lobachevsky published his independently in Russia. He acknowledged in private letters that they had discovered what he had already found. He did not publish. The geometry that might have been called Gaussian went to others who had been willing to face the reaction Gauss had not. There is something worth understanding about why Gauss withheld the non-Euclidean geometry that goes beyond mere cowardice. He had grown up in a world in which Kant's philosophy was dominant in German intellectual culture, and Kant had argued that Euclidean geometry was a necessary truth. not an empirical discovery, but a feature of how the human mind organized its experience of space, built into cognition rather than discovered in nature. This meant that non-Euclidean geometry, to the Kantian establishment, was not merely an academic curiosity, but a philosophical provocation. The resistance would not have been merely professional but philosophical, and Gauss, who was deeply read in philosophy, understood exactly how deep the resistance would run. He may also have been uncertain, in a way he rarely was about mathematical results, whether non-Euclidean geometry was merely consistent or whether it was actually true, whether the space of physical reality was Euclidean or not. He had, during the geodetic survey, attempted to measure the angles of a large triangle formed by 3 mountain peaks to see whether they summed to exactly 180 degrees as Euclidean geometry required, or whether the sum deviated. The deviation, if any, was within the measurement error of his instruments. He could not tell whether physical space was Euclidean. The question remained, in his private assessment, genuinely open. It was left to Riemann, and to Einstein, to resolve the question. The space of physical reality is not Euclidean. It is curved, in the way Gauss's Theorema Egregium described. Gauss had found the mathematics that would describe the true geometry of nature, and had failed, for reasons that were part caution and part philosophy and part the particular silence that descended on him when he was not certain, to publish it. The great irony of his career is that the man who found the geometry of the universe never told the universe what he had found. In 1831, a young physicist named Wilhelm Weber arrived at the University of Göttingen, and the course of Gauss's later career changed in a way that was both unexpected and, in retrospect, entirely natural. Weber was 27 years old, energetic and experimentally gifted, with a deep interest in electricity and magnetism, the phenomena that were, in the 1830s, at the cutting edge of physical investigation. He had been a student at the University of Halle, and had already published work on the physics of wave motion that showed both technical ability and genuine physical intuition. He was also, crucially, a man who understood the value of mathematical rigor, and who recognized in Gauss a mind that could bring to the study of electricity a theoretical depth that the field had not yet received. The two men formed a partnership that would last until Weber's forced departure from Göttingen in 1837, and the work they produced together was among the most practically significant of Gauss's career. The friendship between Gauss and Weber was not merely professional. Weber was young enough to be Gauss's son, and there was something of the quality of an idealized father-son relationship in the way the two men worked together, Gauss providing the mathematical framework, the rigor, the deep theoretical grounding, Weber providing the experimental ingenuity, the physical intuition, the willingness to get his hands dirty with instruments and measurements. They ate together, walked together, argued about physics together, in the way that people who are genuinely engaged with the same problem argue, with the freedom that comes from knowing that the other person is following, that no explanation needs to be simplified, that the conversation can go as fast and as deep as the subject requires. For Gauss, who had rarely found a collaborator whose technical ability could keep up with him, the relationship with Weber was a late gift, and he valued it accordingly. Gauss had not previously worked extensively on electricity and magnetism. He was a mathematician and an astronomer, and the phenomena of the electromagnetic world, the sparks and deflections and mysterious attractions that experimenters like Faraday in England were busy cataloging and measuring, had not, before Weber's arrival, claimed a large share of his attention. But he was a man who went wherever the interesting mathematics led, and the mathematics of electricity and magnetism was interesting in ways that became clear to him once Weber had brought him into the experimental side of the work. Their first major collaboration concerned Earth's magnetic field. Gauss applied his mathematical methods to the description of the geomagnetic field, the complex, spatially varying magnetic environment of the Earth's surface that compasses detected, but that no one had yet described in a systematic mathematical way. He developed a mathematical framework, a decomposition of the magnetic field into components corresponding to different sources, that allowed the field to be described with great precision from measurements made at different locations. He established a network of magnetic observatories around the world, coordinated through correspondence, all making measurements according to standardized procedures that allowed their data to be combined and compared. This was in itself a significant achievement, the first systematic global scientific measurement network, coordinated from Göttingen, producing data that Gauss could analyze with the mathematical tools he had been developing for decades. It was also, more broadly, a demonstration of a new kind of science, quantitative, global, collaborative, based on standardized instruments and coordinated observations, that would become the model for large-scale scientific investigation in the following centuries. But the most dramatic practical achievement of the Gauss-Weber collaboration was something smaller and more immediate: the first electromagnetic telegraph. In 1833, the two men strung a wire approximately a mile long between the physics laboratory and the observatory, passing over the rooftops of several intervening buildings, and used it to transmit signals by means of an electromagnetic deflector at each end. A current sent down the wire deflected a needle at the far end, and by arranging the deflections into a code, messages could be transmitted almost instantaneously over the distance. The system they built was, by later standards, primitive: a single wire, a limited vocabulary of signals, a code that required practice to use fluently. But it worked, and it demonstrated the basic principle of the electric telegraph, that information could be encoded in electrical signals and transmitted at the speed of electricity, several years before the better-known systems of Wheatstone and Morse. Gauss and Weber did not exploit their invention commercially. They used it for their scientific work, sending measurements and observations between the two buildings, and wrote about it in scientific publications, but they did not pursue the patents or the business arrangements that would have been required to turn a scientific demonstration into a commercial enterprise. They were scientists, not entrepreneurs. Weber was forced to leave Göttingen in 1837, along with 6 other professors who had signed a protest against the King of Hanover's revocation of the Constitution. The so-called Göttingen Seven, Gauss's son-in-law Heinrich Ewald was among them, were dismissed from their positions, and some were exiled from the country. Gauss, who was politically cautious in a way that sometimes shaded into timidity, did not sign the protest. He kept his position. His relationship with Weber survived the political crisis, and the two men resumed correspondence and eventually collaboration when Weber returned to Göttingen years later. But the episode left a residue of discomfort, the awareness that he had not done what some others had been willing to do, and the question of whether the caution had been wisdom or cowardice. In his later years, Gauss turned to problems in physics more broadly, to potential theory, the mathematical description of gravitational and electrical fields, to the foundations of mechanics, to the theory of capillary action. He contributed to each of these with work that, in another man's career, would have been landmarks. In Gauss's career, they were the work of old age, significant, careful, thorough, but not quite at the level of the masterpieces. He was aware of this, or aware of the passage of time, which is not quite the same thing. He had always been slow to publish, and in his later years the slowness increased, the diary filling more slowly, the polished results emerging at longer intervals, the pile of unpublished work in his drawers growing heavier with each year. He continued to work on what interested him, in the way that people do when they have always had the luxury of following their interest rather than the market. He read widely. Novels, history, languages. He taught himself Russian in his 60s, partly in order to read Lobachevsky's non-Euclidean geometry in the original, and he read the great Russian novelists with genuine pleasure. He was, in these respects, a man of broader cultivation than the image of the pure mathematician might suggest. A man who had come from nothing, had been given access to the whole of human culture, and had not taken any of it for granted. The forced departure of Weber and the other Göttingen Seven in 1837 left the university diminished and left Gauss in a position of uncomfortable isolation. He had not signed the protest, and the colleagues who had been closest to him professionally were gone or under political shadow. He wrote to friends and colleagues outside Göttingen with increased frequency in these years, as if the expulsion of the Seven had reminded him of his dependence on intellectual community, which he had always valued, even if he had never sought it out aggressively. Weber returned to Göttingen in 1849, after the political changes of 1848 made it possible, and the reunion was warm. The two men were now, respectively, 71 and 45 years old, and the vigorous collaborative energy of the 1830s could not be entirely recovered. But they resumed correspondence, exchanged ideas, and gave each other the particular companionship of people who have worked together closely and remember the quality of what was produced. Weber outlived Gauss by nearly 30 years and did some of his best work on the absolute measurement of electrical resistance, on the velocity of electricity in conductors in the decades after Gauss's death, building on the mathematical framework that their collaboration had established. The telegraph that Gauss and Weber had built and forgotten about was, by the time Weber returned to Göttingen, a commercial reality across Europe and America. Morse's system had been demonstrated in the late 1830s, and by the 1840s, telegraph lines were being strung along railway routes across Germany and England and France. The communication revolution that Gauss and Weber had demonstrated with a wire across the Göttingen rooftops was transforming commerce and diplomacy and journalism, shrinking the effective distances between cities, making possible a kind of near-instantaneous communication that had been the stuff of fantasy only a generation earlier. Gauss watched this development with the equanimity of a man who had seen where it was going before it went there, and who had been too absorbed in other things to do anything about it. In the last decades of his life, Gauss became something of a legend. Not in the way that Einstein became a legend, explosively and publicly, but in the quieter and more lasting way that a fixed point becomes a landmark. He was simply there, at the Göttingen Observatory, in the same house, at the same desk, working on the same kinds of problems he had been working on all his life, receiving a steady stream of visitors who came from across Europe to pay their respects to the man they regarded as the greatest living mathematician. Visitors often found him polite, precise, and slightly remote, as if part of his attention were always elsewhere, which, in all likelihood, it was. He would answer questions about his work with care and completeness, but he rarely invited the questioner further in, rarely volunteered the kind of personal engagement that would have made the encounter feel like more than a formal tribute. He never married a third time after Friederike's death in 1831. He lived alone, in the observatory house with a housekeeper, and later with his daughter Therese, who kept house for him in his final years with a patient devotion that he acknowledged and was grateful for. in his characteristically quiet way. His other children had moved away. His son Joseph had become a military officer. His son Eugene had emigrated to America after a quarrel with his father that was never fully repaired. His son Wilhelm had followed Eugene to America some years later. He was in correspondence with them, but the correspondence was dutiful rather than intimate, and the distance, literal and emotional, between Gauss and his children was a sadness that the later biographies note without fully explaining. He was not a warm father. He had loved Johanna, his first wife, with a completeness that left him, after her death, somewhat depleted in his capacity for the kinds of open emotional engagement that families require. He provided for his children, saw to their educations, arranged their careers where he could, wrote to them with the correctness that duty required. But the warmth that had been natural with Johanna was not easily replicated, and the children seemed to have grown up with a father who was a distant presence, revered, provided for, but not intimate. Eugene, in America, eventually found success as a merchant and businessman, and wrote home occasionally with news that his father received with polite interest. The quarrel that had driven Eugene away was never publicly described in detail. It seems to have been the kind of clash that happens between a domineering father and a son who has decided to live a different kind of life, and it left a permanent mark on both of them. His professional relationships were more comfortable, if still characteristically guarded. He had students, some of them outstanding. Bernhard Riemann, who would extend Gauss's ideas on curved surfaces into the general theory of curved spaces that bears his name. Richard Dedekind, who would later develop the rigorous foundations of the real number system and whose careful, scrupulous mathematical style bore the imprint of everything he had absorbed from Göttingen. Peter Gustav Lejeune Dirichlet, who became one of the greatest number theorists of the century and who served, in effect, as Gauss's intellectual heir in that field. Gauss was not a warm mentor to these men in the personal sense. He did not encourage or praise easily, did not establish the kind of close working relationships that some academic supervisors form with their best students. But he recognized their abilities, pointed them toward important problems, and gave them, through the example of his work and the rigor of his standards, a model for mathematical thought that influenced their whole careers. Riemann's story is particularly poignant. He came to Göttingen as a young man of extraordinary ability and met Gauss, who was by then in his late 70s and not in good health. Gauss recognized Riemann's gifts almost immediately, with the certainty of a man who had spent his life recognizing mathematical ability and rarely been wrong. He told colleagues that Riemann had shown him a gloriously fertile originality. He gave Riemann a topic for his inaugural lecture, The Foundations of Geometry. That was a provocation and a gift simultaneously. Precisely the territory that Gauss himself had thought about and not published on, the theory of curved space and non-Euclidean geometry that he had kept in his notebooks for decades. Riemann delivered a lecture in 1854, in Gauss's presence, that laid the foundations of what would become Riemannian geometry. Gauss sat and listened, and by several accounts he was visibly moved. A reaction that those who knew him found unusual, because Gauss was not easily moved by anything. He died the following year, before seeing the full consequences of the young man's ideas. But he had seen enough. He knew what Riemann had done. He knew where it would lead. In the last years of his life, Gauss was afflicted with heart problems and edema, the accumulation of fluid that made movement increasingly difficult and painful. He continued to work. The notebooks were still being filled, the correspondence still being answered, the unfinished projects still receiving their occasional attention. but the pace slowed, and the health deteriorated steadily through 1854 and into 1855. He died on the 23rd of February, 1855, in his sleep, in the house at the Göttingen Observatory, where he had lived and worked for nearly 50 years. He was 77 years old. The obituaries that followed were numerous and distinguished, because Gauss had outlived most of his contemporaries, and had been, for the last decades of his life, unambiguously the foremost mathematician in the world. He was mourned by the mathematical community with a thoroughness that reflected the scale of his achievements, and by the broader scientific world with a respect that testified to how far his influence had extended beyond pure mathematics. The King of Hanover commissioned a memorial medal. The University of Göttingen arranged a series of commemorative lectures. The collected works began to be prepared, a project that would take decades and would eventually fill 12 large volumes, each one dense with the results of a lifetime of extraordinary productivity. What those collected works revealed, as the full extent of Gauss's unpublished manuscripts became known, as the mathematical diary was found and deciphered, as the notebooks were opened and read, was staggering. The published work alone had been sufficient to establish him as one of the greatest mathematicians in history. The unpublished work showed that the published work was only a fraction of what he had found. The non-Euclidean geometry he had discovered decades before Bolyai and Lobachevsky. The elliptic functions that Abel and Jacobi had published independently and received full credit for, which Gauss had found earlier and recorded in his diary. The results in number theory, in analysis, in the theory of functions, that were found in his papers after his death and that would have been celebrated as major advances if he had published them when he found them. The standard description of Gauss that emerged from this posthumous reckoning, the image that mathematical history settled on, was of a man so far ahead of his time that he had routinely discovered things that the rest of mathematics would not catch up with for decades, who had kept them private by a combination of perfectionism and caution, and who had, as a result, deprived his contemporaries of advances they might have built on. There is truth in this, and there is also something that needs to be said in his defense. Gauss was not withholding his work out of vanity or competition or desire for priority. He was withholding it out of a standard of intellectual completeness that he held himself to, and that he would not relax regardless of the consequences. He would rather die with a notebook full of unpublished truths than publish something he considered unfinished. Pauca sed matura, few but ripe. He meant it, completely, to the end. He had come from a room in Brunswick, where his father counted out workers, wages by candlelight, and he had ended in a house on the grounds of one of the greatest astronomical observatories in Europe, having changed the face of mathematics not once, but many times. He had given to the world the disquisitiones arithmeticae, and the method of least squares, and the theory of curved surfaces, and the theorema egregium, and the prediction of series, and the foundations of potential theory, and more, and had kept in his drawers and his diary things that the world will never fully know. He had lived quietly and worked without cease, and said near the end that mathematics was the queen of the sciences and arithmetic was the queen of mathematics. He had spent his life in her service. He did not think this required explaining, and he was probably right. The mathematical world mourned him with the thoroughness his achievements deserved. Dirichlet, who succeeded Gauss in the Göttingen chair, delivered a memorial address that catalogued the achievements and tried to give some sense of the whole, the sweep and the depth of what a single life had produced. The task was not easy. The full extent of what Gauss had done was still being discovered, and it would continue to be discovered for decades. The mathematical diary, found in 1898 and decoded with some difficulty from its compressed notation, gave the clearest picture of how fertile the hidden life had been. Entry after entry, results that others had published and been celebrated for, recorded by Gauss years or decades earlier in the small private notebook that only he had read. He was called the Prince of Mathematics in his lifetime, and the title was not flattery but description, a precise assessment of where he stood in the hierarchy of those who had thought hardest and seen furthest into the world of number and space and form. He was buried in Göttingen, under a headstone that identified him as the Prince of Mathematicians. Above the grave, across the city he had inhabited for most of his long life, the observatory domes still turned with the seasons, tracking the stars he had spent decades measuring and predicting. The sky continued its ancient courses overhead, and beneath it, in the quiet room of the mathematical world that Gauss had furnished and decorated and left for others to inhabit, the Queen of the Sciences continued her reign,